I naturally, I think, take a greater interest in what happens to English rhythmically, what happens to the strong and weak syllables of English and so on, and how they affect each other, than I do in the vowels and consonants. And I think there's a natural reason to this. Although, of course, when one learns a foreign language, one has to make an attempt at some consonant sounds, perhaps that one doesn't normally use in one's own language, and some vowel sounds. Certainly for everybody this is the case in English, because you're a bit unlucky about English, really. Whatever other language you speak, you are not going to find a more complicated vowel system than the English one. You'll find an equally complicated one if you speak one of the other Germanic languages. But the Germanic languages are the king languages, the top languages in the world for complexity of their vowel system. So obviously I'm not advocating neglect of vowels and consonants, but even so, the thing I think one could well remember is that that's all right, no hurry. I'm get comfortable because I haven't started the lecture yet. I'm just talking in general. I'm talking about the problems of EFL users. It's a problem to tackle our consonants. Yes, there are some awkward little things like th and the and so on. Not many, not too bad. There are pretty big problems with our vowel system because the rest of the world usually has 5 or most 6 vowels on average, shall we say. So if you speak Japanese or Spanish and so on, then you've got the traditional 5 vowels as usual. You've not got less than most other people, and you've not got more. But English has got a lot more. English has got a great mouthful of vowels, so it's a pity. But that's it. If you want to make the distinctions that practically all native English speakers make, and most learners manage to reproduce reasonably well, then you've got to have a go at our system of about 11 or 12 simple vowels, besides having diphthongs. So, all right, I'm not playing down the importance of that, but what I would point out is that we can forgive and understand easily and not feel desperately not at home with people who don't quite manage some of our consonants or don't quite manage some of our vowel distinctions, partly because we're perfectly used to listening to people who speak certain kinds of English where some of these distinctions that operate in standard English throughout the world don't operate. In Cockney, for instance, you'll be hearing about from Professor Wells later in the week, they don't have the THF contrast, the th-f contrast, which is difficult for most people. And in various other kinds of English, they don't have some of the vowel contrasts we have. In Scottish English, for instance, I know it's a very small number of the total number of native English speakers, but we all understand the Scottish accents quite happily, educated Scottish accents. Scottish people speaking standard English with their Scottish accent don't really give us a lot of trouble at all. We understand them easily, we're well disposed towards them, but they don't make such a fundamental distinction made by all the rest of the English-speaking world as the difference in the vowels in good and food. But anyway, I'm saying all this only by way of preamble, because I haven't got on to my topic for today yet properly, and that is we're turning our attention away from the vowels and consonants for the moment, and say not that they aren't important, but if you remember then that we are used to hearing variations on those systems from native English speakers even, leave alone people who have not got English as a native language, and we, as listeners, we cope with this fairly well. We're not upset by it, we understand it, even sometimes like it. My mother used to say, oh, isn't broken English beautiful? She liked Charboyer and Maurice Chevalier, you know, the certain people with heavy French accents who was to be seen in films. So, okay, yeah, it is sometimes mildly entertaining or rather charming at times, yes. Although I wondered how much the charm was in the man and not in the linguistic forms he was using. It's always difficult to sort those two things out. But if we are used then to coping with slight variations on our set of consonant distinctions and quite big variations in the vowel patterns used by other native speakers, What is it that makes English so very easy to understand by other English speakers throughout the world? What is it that we are listening for? What is it we're getting right away and quickly? And what is it we have in common all over the world? Even if we have, because you know, if you take an if Australian says bed, he means B-A-D. If I say it, I mean B-E-D, right? So, it doesn't matter. Tune into an Australian accent in a second or two. It only takes 2 or 3 seconds to establish. He's going to say all his vowels on my little list as number 4, they're going to sound like my number 3 when I utter it. Doesn't matter. I could adjust that and no problem. So what is it that unifies English then, transfer? Well, it's largely the very individual and specific patterns of rhythm that we have. And this rhythm goes right through. The rhythm, of course, is the alternation of heavy and light, strong and weak, firm and weak, whatever you want to call it. But rhythm goes through the whole of the structure of English. You have different rhythms in syllables. You can see syllable rhythm patterns varying. We can see different patterns of rhythm within words, and of course the rhythm of sentences is extremely important. In fact, getting the wrong stress on accentuation of a sentence is the worst thing of all that you can do to confuse English speakers. You will hardly ever confuse him by getting a word wrong, because he will guess, even if he hears you saying bed when he is expecting bad, he's not going to really. I mean, I remember when I was teaching in Sweden once, I asked the lady who introduced me to the classes, where am I going to be teaching this evening? She said, in those bedrooms over there. I thought I'd heard of Swedish freedom and so on. She meant not those bedrooms, but those bad rooms. You know, she didn't like those rooms. But anyway, my first reaction, I immediately recognized that it wasn't her intention. Although if you listen to Merlina Mercuri, she maintained that was the best place to learn English, but that's another story, yes. Okay. So one can immediately recognize in context what a person means, but it is rather off-putting if a person constantly uses the rhythm that you're not expecting and that sounds like one he doesn't want to have for a particular phrase, sentence, and so on. And that's why we're looking at some of these things that affect rhythm. And so here we are. I'm going to take you through these today. It's a rather easy topic this morning because we're going to use the ideas that we establish at this session to look at the more important things that come on for the next session. We're going to see what there is that can affect rhythm, and then we're going to see which of them do affect rhythm and how they affect it and how seriously they affect it. I hope by the end of the second of this pair of lectures you'll agree with me how important it is. But anyway, first of all, what are the phenomena then that affect rhythm, that enable one syllable to be said more quickly, another one more slowly, and so on? Well, I've divided them up into four types of things. And I mentioned them in this first paragraph here. And I say in the very first paragraph, the great majority of the most commonly used English words have more than one syllable, and very few words of more than one syllable are not frequently changed in their forms. That means that people often, learning English as a foreign language, when they first begin to learn it, have a seriously wrong idea about English. They imagine that when they've looked up a word in a dictionary and they've seen a form for it, then they've understood it and can read it aloud in that form, that they will hear it in that form forever and ever, right? That's very far from the truth. Now, that's the bad news, right? Now, the good news is this, right? You don't need to worry about your own performance. You can use that form you find in the dictionary as the target pronunciation quite happily all the time. You don't have to make these many little adjustments that we make. But we do make a lot of little adjustments to make things go more smoothly for us. There is no law which says you must speak English fast, right? So you can take it at your own pace. Some English speakers do speak much slower than others, and you adopt your pace and see how you get on, and aim for these forms you find in the dictionary. But now, here's the bad news again, if you like. there are a certain number of words that you can't take that attitude to, right? And I'm not going to be discussing them now. I'm going to be discussing them in the next lecture. They are the words that I call the weak form words, and they are perhaps the most important set of words in English altogether, because they are the words that operate the grammatical system. But first of all, I want to look at the phenomena that cause these changes, see how many of them there are, and we'll then see how they act when they're applied to these very important words we're coming on to. So I say most of the differences I'm going to talk about now are not terribly difficult. So there's a lot of good news in this particular session, right? So, all right, very few words of two syllables aren't affected. In fact, probably none. And of course, monosyllables are also affected, but they're affected in rather minor ways. Things like having the first sound matched up more to the last sound matched up to the first sound of a following word. This kind of thing is almost always dealt with in textbooks on English phonetics, and I think often, in a way, gives the wrong idea unintentionally. But the kind of thing I'm talking about is, if you take an expression like good boy, for instance, right? Now, you would expect me to write D there when I'm good boy, but you will know, and you probably, if you've read any textbook on phonetics, it is admitted that quite a lot of people at times say good boy, and certainly very many people say goodbye like that, because that's a phrase we're using all the time and saying very quickly and rather casually and carelessly. Well, the fact is, the good news, or the bad news rather, is that we do that. We mess about, turn the word good into what seems to be the word gub, right? There's no word gub in English as far as I know, right? Well, that's the bad news. But the good news is you don't need to do it, and you will find that although we do it quite a lot, we don't do it all the time, and we don't do it even the majority of the time. Usually words contain a perfectly clear version of what they are. In other words, most of the time I would expect good boy to be pronounced that way and not this way, most of the time. And when it is, the difference is so slight when the first version is used that you probably haven't even noticed it up to now, and you could forget about it and be perfectly happy. So now, that's brought me on to the first of the four categories that I'm talking about now, of adaptation of words, change of the basic form of words in order for the rhythm of the sentence to be facilitated. Because, as you can see, if you say good boy and make a bilabial closure here already, you've already got the closure you want for that one. So you can speak faster doing that sort of thing. If you're going to say good boy, you're going to move your tip of your tongue from the alveolar ridge away from it before you can start to make the B. Here you're already there. In other words, this is fractionally faster. And this is no doubt the motive for people who say it. They're either being careless or they're taking shortcuts, they're taking an easy way of saying things. And it doesn't much matter. It happens wholesale. On the other hand, as I say, having said that, you don't ever need to bother. It's not compulsory in any word I can think of in English. Even words like grandfather, well, it's not a very good example. Even words like goodbye, for instance, you don't have to do it all the time. You don't have to say goodbye. In fact, if a person says it very slowly, it sounds odd to me. Goodbye sounds strange. It tends to happen when the person is speaking quite fluently. So I would positively advise you not to try and adopt those things. And I've seen countless proof of the fact that a lot of textbooks on English phonetics that do discuss this topic seem to make too much of it. Because whenever it's important, people know whether a B or a P or a D is being used. People know whether a comparable thing, an M or an N is being used. For instance, there's the well-known, I hope I spell it right, Australian state capital, Canberra, and I'm sure that's quite often pronounced with an sorry, I want an N there, Canberra. It's quite often pronounced with an N by some people at times. But I think most of the time people say an N, and you can hear there's an N. Similarly there, if you ever hear at least twice a day on the BBC, you can hear forecasts of what's happening to shipping and so on. And they involve warning of storms at sea and so on. And they constantly mention places like Flamborough Head, and there's one of the islands to the north of Scotland, there's a place called Sunbury. this has an M, and this has an N. And you would think that people wouldn't know whether that is really spelled S-U-N, because there's, and wouldn't know whether that is spelled C-A-M. Or perhaps very unobservant people wouldn't, but actually, if you listen to those regularly as used, those two words, you will know exactly which the person is saying about 95% of the time. And I've proved it to my satisfaction by listening day after day, year after year, to each announcer who comes on at 6 o'clock in the morning, or 5 to 6, and reads these things regularly. I hear no doubt at all what they say couldn't be Sunborough. It is obviously Sunborough. In other words, they do make the distinction. The distinction is the normal thing. That's what we have here. So what have we dealt with there? We've dealt now with the first topic. There are 4 kinds of smoothing, of kinds of accelerating phenomenon, the phenomena that we're discussing. The first one then is assimilation. I've defined it in the 3rd paragraph there as contamination. If you don't like that word just say influence, if you like. I didn't mean contamination in any sort of judgmental way. Influence of an original sound on an adjacent one. Usually it's anticipating the articulatory position of a second sound at the first, but it can work the other way around. For instance, it happens very commonly, although this hardly, I've seen it in one textbook I can make up, hardly ever mentioned, but we often say expressions like all these, right? And if you think I'm going to put the in there, you're right. Normally I would, but sometimes people say, quite commonly, no, not all the time, not the majority of the time, but from time to time they'll say all these, all these. But especially if they're speaking rather negligently, rather very fluently, and not very concerned with that expression, they may slip into saying all these, and that is a kind of assimilation where the following thing gets affected, compared with the other kind of assimilation I'm discussing now, where the preceding thing gets affected by the following one. There are some old-fashioned terms borrowed from German for these that I hate, called retrogressive and progressive. I can never remember which is which. I don't like them. You don't need to talk about them, but I call this type pre-assimilation, that post-assimilation. So, as you wish. I haven't bothered with any term for them here, but it doesn't matter. But now, what have I done in the first paragraph of assimilation? I warned you that they're quite frequent, but they're totally optional. You need never bother to say anything like this, although perhaps it's not a bad idea if you do know that it can happen, because then you won't be thrown, you won't be puzzled, perhaps, by hearing something that sounded a bit strange to you, if you realise that this is a kind of thing that occasionally native speakers at least can do. So, I've given a couple of examples of where perhaps even you could consider making the adjustments yourself. I'm not even 100% sure of these, but if you've got things involving the palato-alveolar consonants, they tend to be more regularly treated this way by native English speakers than any other types. And the 2 examples I give now, the compound on bus shelter, right? Bus shelter, bus shelter. Actually, it doesn't sound at all wrong to say bus shelter. And what happened when I said bus shelter is that I rather quickly but gradually changed my S into a sh. In other words, there's no point where I could decide I'd stopped saying S and started saying sh. But I've got both sounds in separate. So even that's not absolutely essential. And is she, well, that sounds very natural and normal to me. And is she, well, that is one I would avoid, because is she, if you, I exaggerated there. I stayed too long in the ears. It wasn't normal. It wasn't natural to be so slow on that. Is she? Is more natural. And what have I done then? Well, I've actually lost the j, or the z sound, the second letter in my transcription of the word is wouldn't be there. It's just the vowel. So that in those extreme types, adopt them if you feel like it, but again, I'm not pressing them on to you as important at all. They are a minor phenomenon. So I'm going to leave that topic of assimilation quite soon. But before I do, I'll just mention something that will clarify the position for you, I think, I hope, in terms of what I mean when I say continuous speech phenomena. I mean the effect of one word on another as they come in the stream of speech. I'm not talking about words which have settled into a particular pronunciation that now is their invariable one wherever they occur. They're always said that way, and you expect to find them indicated that way in the dictionary. And in that category, we can have the term used to, for instance. When I have done dictionaries, you possibly know that I recast the Advanced Learners Dictionary pronunciation in 1974, and I also published in 1972 a small pronunciation dictionary of my own. And there I insisted on listing as separate words of the language the word used to, for instance, because nobody says used to, right? Nobody says that word, but if hyphenate would be nice. Nobody says used to if they mean was accustomed to. I used to go to the cinema a lot. I used to. Nobody says that and utters the sound Z for it. If you're going to say Z, right, then you're going to say used to, then you have a totally different meaning. Now, it doesn't mean was accustomed, it means employed, was employed. For instance, quills, the feathers of birds, used to be used to write with. Used. Now the second one's employed to write with, used to write with. You could say that. A rather tortuous sentence, but there it has both used to's in it. There's a difference, and this one has developed, this used to one with, in the sense of what accustomed to, has developed a regular, permanent, only S. And if you fail to use that, then you're saying the wrong word as far as native English speakers are concerned. You might be saying employed instead of accustomed. So take care that you get the right one there. You can too, if you wish, do it with supposed to. Most people do. But that one has only recently got in the dictionary. As a matter of fact, I don't remember it being in any dictionary before my own in 1972. But it's certainly in the Wells dictionary, and it's very common indeed, supposed to. But you don't have to use it, because supposed to sounds perfectly normal and natural. You've got a lot of choices here where you can take the easy way out. But you haven't got the easy way out, really, with certain words that have already made their changes. Now, I've given 2 or 3 examples here. I've given gooseberry, raspberry, fivepence, and newspaper, right? Well, I think you probably can get away with no, fivepence doesn't sound right. Fivepence, if you're going to use it at all. And these days, of course, we tend to say 5 pence anyway, because we had that traumatic experience in 1971 of casting aside our clumsy old pre-decimal coinage and getting onto the decimal coinage we've got now, and a lot of little changes occur at that time. 1 or 2 of which I'll discuss with you again later. And newspaper, well, people tend to analyse it and see it means the paper gives you the news. So some people do say newspaper, so you needn't worry about that one much. But you will find, if you actually listen to people, 95% of people say newspaper, 95% say fivepence. And everybody who speaks standard English says, well, who speaks standard English of the South, says gooseberry and raspberry. In the North they say gooseberry and raspberry, but that's Northern English. And you're the kind that you have, as a model and dictionaries. Yes, those pronunciations are in John Wells' dictionary. The Wells Dictionary, the new London pronunciation dictionary, made an important step forward. It recognised that certain pronunciations were standard but northern, and it included them. And that's something that hadn't been done before. I think it was a very fine thing about that dictionary that is not taken too much notice of by a lot of other people, because there are certain very widespread, well-educated pronunciations in the north of England that don't match southern ones, and he being a northerner himself by origin, by extraction, he's been aware of those. Right, now, last thing about assimilation then. Don't worry about assimilation at all, as far as doing it is concerned. But do worry if you belong to one of the group I've mentioned here, a speaker of French or Greek or Slavonic language, or some Far Eastern African languages sporadically. If you have this tendency to make an assimilation which we don't make, and that is a pre-assimilation of voicing in certain situations. Now, the best way I can show you how this has a bad effect is to illustrate it by showing you what we mentally picture as the spelling of the word that you're using if you do that. If instead of saying back door, you say bag door, right? Instead of saying bus route, you say buzz route. If instead of saying iceberg, you say iceberg. Instead of saying juice bottle, you say juice bottle. Right? Instead of saying wristwatch, you say wristwatch. Right? Or instead of saying rope ladder, you say robe ladder. Instead of saying roast beef, you say rose beef, which is, of course, normal French roast beef. And instead of saying on horseback, you say on horseback. We're getting to rather silly things that you'd rather not be saying, I'm sure. So be careful of them. Be on your guard against that. But that's the only important thing to be said about assimilation. It's a very minor topic at this stage for EFL rhythm and so on. Well, the second one is elision. This is more important, but this is the leaving out of a sound. And you know, these two terms are strange. We've had terms for them for hundreds of years, really. Special words for it happening in language, you know, because elision means omission, that's all. But we keep a special word for it applied to language. Shows how conscious people have been of the fact that things do get omitted in the course of a piece of speech. And the same way with assimilation, we've had that term around for a long while because people have been very clear that it was a linguistic phenomenon. But anyway, I think this should cause you little trouble. And if you turn up the top of the next page, the reverse page, you'll see I give examples like breaststroke, first stop, masked ball, next time. I left the T out at the end of of the first word, the word next in next time. I just had the K and the S. That was quite enough to be saying before another T. If you try and put all those consonants in and say next time, you will slow yourself down unbearably and you'll sound very artificial. Nobody speaking normally in natural conversation says next time. Of course, the sin here is the one of releasing a final T. I hope you know it's a rule of English allophones that if a word, a first word, ends in a plosive consonant, and so on, and the next word begins with a consonant, not with a vowel, then you don't release that plosive consonant normally, really. You do half of that plosive and go on to start the next one. You don't quite complete it. So it's an unreleased or not fully released consonant. Anyway, I think you're not going to have much trouble with those as long as you don't overdo trying to be clear and let yourself do the natural thing that native speakers do. They naturally simplify it by losing the last sound in an expression like masked ball. When I say masked ball, it sounds ridiculous if I really try and say every time masked ball, masked ball. Even leave the K out if you like, a masked ball. I didn't say the K that last time. It didn't sound awful to me. In the context, it'll be quite understandable. And I've given some examples there of very common further assimilations that we make. You don't have to make, but we do quite often. In other words, instead of saying a good deal, we often say a good deal better. Instead of take care, we sometimes say take care. Instead of prime minister, we say prime minister, prime minister. Prime being a word for peep into somebody else's business, interfere. Yes, sometimes people write letters to the newspaper objecting to the fact that television and radio newsreaders have said prime minister instead of prime minister. Stupid thing to do because they say it all the time. It's just that what one does find is that retired clergymen and retired army officers have nothing better to do but sit and watch television because they're on their pensions and there's nothing occupying their minds, so they'd rather start fussing over the way people speak in the television news bulletins and then waste editors' time in newspapers. But unfortunately, when it gets around to the silly season, this time of year, you know, you've heard of the silly season in our newspapers. At this time of year, newspapers print anything, however silly, because they want to fill up the space. There's no news, nothing much happening this time of year normally, because Parliament has gone down, everybody's on their holidays, only a few wars here and there, and they won't fill up these middle pages, the correspondence columns, so they'll print some silly letter about somebody who suddenly noticed something that he should have known long ago if he'd had any degree of education in linguistics, but of course you can't expect that of army officers, can you? So there you are. Other examples, extra tension instead of extra attention, and so on. And now, getting on to the same thing as I was saying about assimilation. Right, it's true that these ongoing reductions I just mentioned, you have to make them when they're heavy groups of consonants, like S, K, T, and then another consonant. You have to make them there. Ordinarily, you don't have to make any reductions. It's only these heavy groupings that are rather unusual, if you like. And you have to do it if the word has actually changed its form, if it's internal to a word and we're no longer up against the matter of words coming together in the stream of speech, but coming to a form that you'll find in the dictionary if the dictionary is up to date. And dictionaries very, very often aren't up to date. I think you can rely on Professor Wells's dictionary very happily, and the Advanced Learner's Dictionary and the Longman Dictionary of Contemporary English, but dictionaries meant for the native English speaker. Be very careful that you don't take too much notice of them, because they usually represent the English of 50 or 100 years ago, if that. So even Daniel Jones's dictionary, I'm afraid, is not free from much criticism in that respect. I was shocked years ago when I saw what he'd got for the word actually, for instance. Well, actually, that word's been pronounced with 3 syllables for a very long time, but you could look at the Daniel Jones dictionary and imagine that it's intended to be pronounced actually. Actually. And you will actually hear people say it that way, one time in 10,000. Elderly people who are speaking very slowly. So there you are. No, it's actually, generally, usually. These are all 3 syllables, even 2. In fact, usually is usually 2 syllables. It depends. And temporarily has got shortened in the last 30 years. There are still 1 or 2 clever people around in the BBC can actually manage to say temporarily. But when they do, I can almost see the smile of satisfaction. They say, having got all the syllables out. But they're the only ones doing it. I know 1 or 2 pride themselves on doing it. Very, very nice people, but they're misguided, really, because the rest of us have stopped making any difference between that temporarily and temporarily. Or, if they don't, they take another easy way out and do it the American way. Quite a lot of British people do what the Americans do. They make it easy by having a stronger stress a bit later. And Americans say temporarily. So, okay, do it that way if you like. It doesn't matter. Right. Middle paragraph then. Examples like postman, windmill, grandfather. Don't. See? Doesn't matter whether you put the T in or not, but if you do put the T or the D or whatever in, don't release it, for heaven's sake, because if you release it, if you say postman, I said the T there, but you could hardly hear it. But if I say postman, now it sounds as much like posterman as postman, right? In the same way, windmill sounds like windermill, or halfway to it anyway. And grandfather sounds like, if you say the D, sounds like as much like grandfather as grandfather. So don't release that consonant. Keep it a minimum length. And remember that in this last set of words there, words like calm, blackguard, cupboard, soften, Christmas, they've lost some of their consonants forever. I mean, I hope nobody said, well, I did hear once in my life I heard somebody put the T in Christmas. I was absolutely shocked, you know. We put it back in too often, so you never know what's going to happen. 70 years ago, the word often was very rarely pronounced often. Now, you'll often hear it pronounced often, and not so often pronounced often. So, there you are. The thing is, of course, check with a dictionary about things like that. Cupboard, I'm sure you knew. Blackguard, probably you didn't know. Anyway, as it's not a very useful word, you can forget it again. But there it is. That kind of thing does happen. And finally, on the matter of elision, I'll give you the most important tip, I think, really. You have to be particularly careful with pair of consonants that are really double consonants, we treat as one, behave as one largely. They are more of a problem. And these are the 2 Africas, ch and j, right? And now I give an example of what people will hear, what will suggest to people if you misuse them in expression like, instead of saying village church, because we don't say which church, we say which church. We say the ch twice. We don't elide or shorten the first one. So if you want to say village church, but you don't say the j at the end properly, then you say village church, whatever that means. How you villy a church, I don't know. I've never heard the verb to villy before. But this looks like the past tense of a village church, right? Or H.G. Wells. Well, obviously you know who that is. The famous writer H.G. Wells. You have to say the ch properly. H.G. Wells. And watch chain. Well, I don't wear a chain. I wear a wristwatch. But If you talk about a watch chain but leave the ch out in the first word, then you've got a watch chain, which sounds like some totally different thing. So be careful of those. But there are certain, now this is the good news again, there are certain nice little devices we have for making life easy for us, and that is in plurals of words with th. We don't say 5/6. You know, I've been I've heard lessons being given where teachers are carefully drilling their pupils in a school abroad in saying things that nobody ever attempts to say, like 5, 6, 11, 11ths, and so on. These things just don't come out that way. Now, the strategies we use are a little bit complicated sometimes, so perhaps you could leave yourself trying to say them but not worry too much. But what you can recognize, for instance, is, and this is one of the most commonly heard mispronunciations of an English word I ever come across, and that is the word month. People can usually say it fine. Certainly people as good as you are can have no trouble about saying the word month in the singular. But I often hear even quite advanced people, as I say 12 months ago, and that is absolutely not possible in English. No native English speaker is ever going to say it that way, unless he's a dialect speaker. Right? It's a survival from the days of King Alfred if he does that. It's the most bizarre. No, what you can do, because you can make it easier, and we do. We don't say the th, but we do keep the s, the plural sign. So we don't say 12 months ago. We say 12 months ago. Months, 12 months ago. And that's fine. Nobody worries about that at all. You can do it with the word clothes too, particularly if it's not highlighted. For instance, I would usually try and say clothes with both the and the z. But if I'm saying a word that this is the word, you know, the word clothing, clothes, plural clothes. But if I'm saying clothes brush, for instance, right, the brush is perhaps more interested in the clothes part of it, or equal, I may lose that altogether, clothes brush, clothes brush. Nobody would notice if I said clothes brush they wouldn't believe for one moment that I was trying to use any word clothes brush, right? Because they know such a word doesn't exist. They wouldn't even notice, I'm sure, that I'd done that. Okay, so that's all I think I've got to say about this sort of thing. There are plenty of examples of that going on. You don't have to put yourself out for them, but don't worry as long as you don't make the wrong ones. By the way, one of the commonest kinds of elision that you hear every day on the radio is when they're quoting from the newspapers, say, and this is, the Times today suggests that, and when you get it, you're expecting, of course, suggests, aren't you, right? Well, if there's no break in the rhythm there, and it goes straight on smoothly, you never hear that. 95% of the time you hear suggest that, and you only hear the T. And this is interesting because it's relatively new. 50 years ago, I think most people would have kicked out the T as well. But it's the influence of middle class people put the T back in. So suggest that is normal now. But suggests that you can't do it smoothly in one little stream of sound, one fluent piece of phrasing. Right. So I've got two more. I've dealt with the two most important ones. I've just got the two least important ones left. Probably the least important one of all is compression, but it's my favourite for a simple reason, actually. I'm going to join myself having a boast now. Because when, about 20-odd years ago, I came to, well, did a lot of work on dictionaries, and I came to consider the kind of terminology we used for this sort of thing, I felt there was a gap in it. And there was no word, there were words to describe my next one, liaison, the two I just dealt with, but there wasn't a word that covered the phenomena that I observe constantly around me, where particularly, typically, for instance, the example I've given here, the word radio is often pronounced not as 3 syllables, but radio as 2, right? By turning the E vowel in the middle of it into a semi-vowel. And there was no term for it, so I offered in my little book called A Guide to English Pronunciation in 1969, the word compression as a suitable word for it, and illustrated it, and I also repeated this in my dictionary in 72. And I'm very happy indeed to find that the leading writer on English pronunciation to the present age has taken up that suggestion and adopted that term for that very phenomenon. And later on this morning, is it, or sometime this week, he'll be talking to you about it, about compression in dictionaries. So compression was the term I introduced into the literature, and I've explained to you what it was for. a nice example of it here is what usually happens to the word powerful, right? We don't usually say powerful, right? We say powerful, powerful. And that's compressing it by losing the oo in the middle, losing some of the vocalic movement. You can say powerful, but usually people, it's not totally abnormal, but it's much better to say powerful with, say, a diphthong rather than a three-vowel sequence. And when it comes to, now there was in the stress, but when it comes to having a word like power or hour, like firepower, for instance, in the last syllable, then be very careful not to make it three syllables, because it sounds most odd. If you say, instead of saying rush hour, which is what we normally say, you say rush hour. Isn't London difficult in the rush hour? Then you've done most of. You'll sound like practically no native English speaker normally does. You must make some reduction there. But there aren't many occasions where these words like hour, power, fire, and so on, that these words turn up in unstressed syllables in that way. So it's not a big problem. So that's compression then. And finally, I've got the other one that can't be covered by the two main phenomena, and that's, well, we often call it liaison or linking. And we talk about a linking R, because mainly this phenomenon is found in English in connection with an R at the sound at the end of a word that's represented in the spelling usually, but not heard when the word's said in isolation. So we've got the word power, doesn't end in R. Americans, of course, have an R in a word like power, right? But power, no. But when we say the power of this and that, then as we come up to the next word beginning with a vowel, we keep, what we're doing, of course, is historically going on saying what we used to say 300 years ago. It's a matter that in the 18th century we stopped saying those vowels rather than we've introduced them in. But of course, in terms of present-day English, they, in a sense, sound as if they're introduced in to make things go more smoothly. And I think some people actually think that and don't see it as a historical phenomenon. But whichever way you look at it, doesn't matter. It's there. And now my advice to you about these is there. Even in something like the idea of it, 95% of all English people say the idea of it, every time with an R in there. There's a girl who gives her name, she's just the latest example I've noticed of it. She gives her name on BBC television when she gives a report. Her name is Emma, first name, and the second name is Udwin. But you wouldn't know that Udwin is a very unusual English name. There may well be an English name Rudwin. So, I mean, one has to hear her, to see her name written to know whether her name is Udwin or Rudwin. Because whenever she gives her name, they sign off at the end of these little sound bites in the television bulletins. She says, BBC, Emma Rudwin. And she puts the R in. Of course, there's no R at the end of the name Emma, as Jane Austen fans will remember. Right? No R at the end of the name Emma. But I've got 1 minute. So I would recommend you keep these, because they sound a little abnormal if you don't. And here's some more examples of that then. On our own, or else, better off, later on, far away, better and better, things of that sort. It's really better to have them in. Now, this is a matter which not all native English speakers agree, because there are certain items which not the majority necessarily tend to do it. And people take it as a shibboleth, as a mark of lack of education if you don't do the right ones. So people often object to drawing, you see, within a word, or withdrawal. And, well, I don't object to them, but I don't say them myself, so you do what you like. I avoid saying because I don't like the sound of them. Prejudice, whatever you want to. But the tendency is there. You will hear very well-educated people in positions of importance, like television newsreader, you will hear them say that sort of thing, although they may get criticised by elderly colonels and elderly clerical gentlemen in the columns of the posher newspapers. Okay, thank you very much.